What's up everybody, back to it today. I hope you all had a good weekend, but today is back to normal because the kids for me have gone back to school, and after F1 went back to school last week with its first week of pre-season testing, you guys have sent me loads of questions. We're going to smash through as many of those as we can today. I've got questions on the Force India and how much it looks like that Mercedes of last year. I've got questions on Mercedes trick steering system, the DAS system on their car. I've got questions on the big aero rakes, the big frames that are attached to the side of the cars as they're tearing around in pre-season testing. What do they do? How do they work? Questions on 2021 car, and so many more questions, so much. Formula One is back and it's generated loads of interest, so thank you for all the questions. I'm going to try and get through as many as I can, but first I've got to take the dogs for a walk. Come on boys, come on. Come on, yeah, come on, come on. Come on, should we go for a walk? Right, welcome back to another Ask Elvis then. We do this every single Monday for those of you who might be new to the channel, and if you've got any questions you ever want answering on anything, whether it's Formula One or Formula E or cars or I mean literally anything, just send them in on any platform, whether it's social media, right here on YouTube, but use the hashtag #AskElvis, and I go through them all on a Sunday and Monday looking for the best ones, and from across all of the platforms you send them in on. I really appreciate the time that you take to send in these questions, because without them, well, we'd have no video. But anyway, we've got loads, as I say, so let's get cracking straight away, and we'll start with that Force India question. Chris Jones puts it very succinctly. He says, Elvis, what are your thoughts on Racing Point's near copy of last year's Mercedes? Well, my thoughts on this are that, a couple of things. First of all, fair play to them. It's within the regulations, and the regulations on this state that certain areas of the car, you know, we've heard about the listed parts, part of the Formula One tech regs, they are the parts that you're allowed to buy in. And there are lots of elements of that, things like suspension, gearboxes. We know lots of teams do this, that's not new. There are a whole other section of the car that within the regulations has to be bespoke, has to be designed by you as a manufacturer. If you want to be a manufacturer within Formula One, you have to design things like the aero surfaces yourself. Brake ducts are new to that list as well. So loads of parts that you just have to design yourself. So what can't have happened is Mercedes have just given Racing Point the drawings for them to copy. That can't happen. But what you can very easily do from, you know, a series of very detailed photos is make your own version of that. And it's not that they have literally taken measurements, and I'm sure if you measured both cars they wouldn't be identical, but they've taken the idea, the concept that Mercedes have pioneered so successfully over the last couple of years. The reason they've done it is because their car was very much a midfield car. They'd been following a philosophy on a very limited budget, so very limited development scope in previous years for them, and they realised that, look, there's a car that is a known quantity in that Mercedes. It works, it's been dominant, it's been very, been very successful. They're using the same power unit, they're using the same gearbox. Why not go for something that's already a proven concept? And so that's exactly what they've done. They've done their version on it. I'm sure that they have taken that, put it into their own design schemes, and probably tweaked elements of it as well. I'm sure they've got areas that they already see that they might be able to develop from that car, perhaps in a different direction than Mercedes went in some areas last year. So it's not that it's an absolute direct copy. It's obviously heavily inspired. And look, even if you want to call it a copy, in my own personal view is that it's absolutely fine. We see every single year teams copying certain elements of all of the cars. We've just gone through a whole reveal of the 2020 cars. So many of those, from the big teams right to the back of the grid, have taken elements from other cars that were clearly somebody else's idea, and they've taken them and adapted them to their own car. So that's nothing new. Personally, I see nothing wrong with it. You know, this is the last year, of course, that this can happen in this way, because 2021, the whole grid's going to have brand new cars. And look, while we're on the subject, Ashley Butterfield says, do you think that Perez in the Racing Point could be fighting with the big three teams this year? Well, I always say to everybody, and it's made me laugh at some of the websites and publications that have literally put the teams in some kind of order after 3 days of pre-season testing based on their performance. When I was working inside the team for all those years, we used to laugh at the, looking from the inside out, we used to laugh at the media who judged what was happening through pre-season testing, because none of us can have any idea what's going on inside each team in terms of whether our car's fast or not. You can read certain things by looking at the body language and the wording that's being put out by the drivers post-session and that kind of thing. What you cannot do is judge anything from lap times. So I'm very hesitant to say that, Perez or the Force India will be mixing it with the top 3. However, what's changed for that team? 2 big things. First of all, they now have a healthy budget, which they have never had in their history. It's been one of the things that's always held them back, and if you just look at that point in itself, they've actually been an incredibly successful team given their budget over the years, haven't they? So now they've got this brilliant team of racers that's been made the most of what they've had, and now they're not so restricted by having to pick and choose their development path so kind of carefully, because now they, a little bit like the big 3 teams, they can start to develop in lots of areas by assessing different options. Oh, sorry, it's windy, I don't know if you can hear me. So they've got this massive budget injection, which, as we know, if you spend it well in Formula 1, definitely can translate into performance and results. My feeling is that they will spend that money well. So that's the first thing. The second thing is they've got this car that, like I said before, it's based on a dominant car from last year, the Mercedes of 2019. So why not could we see Perez and the Force India mixing it at the top? Why not even Stroll? Stroll could find himself in a car way faster than he ever thought he would find himself in Formula 1. Maybe we'll see a different Last Stroll this year too. Okay, so we just had a mini storm here. I'm absolutely drenched all of a sudden. I hope you can see me. The camera might be covered in water as well. Sorry about that. Right, let's get on with this one, then I'm going to head home. The Gingerbread Man says, do drivers consider testing to be fun, boring, or a mix of the two? Well, that's a good one. I actually think it's probably a mix of the two, and obviously it depends up and down the grid, but testing itself, almost all drivers consider boring, for them. And it's weird, isn't it, for us to think of that, because we always think of, if you got to drive a Formula 1 car all day for your job, that must be insane, that must be incredible to pound round and round in an F1 car. But of course they're racers, testing is not racing. Testing is the boring part of their job, if you like. So most drivers don't enjoy testing, is my experience of it all. However, pre-season testing is the first time you get back in a Formula 1 car after months away, so that part of it really quite exciting. But I suspect after day 1 in the car, after your winter break, that excitement wears off, and very quickly it becomes dull again. I think they all like doing some of the exciting stuff, like the Mercedes drivers will have enjoyed testing out that new DAS system, I'm sure. When it comes to things like pounding round and round and round, doing aero runs and that kind of stuff, that's not exciting for a racing driver. It's great for the guys in the garage, because as a mechanic, those long runs are when you finally get to have a little mini break and a cup of tea, because the car's out on circuit for a good 20 minutes or half an hour. Right, both me and the camera are now getting soaked, so I'm going to head home and we'll pick this up a bit later. I'm about to go actually for a coffee with one of my best friends, in fact best man at my wedding, a guy called Mark Arnold, who you may or may not know as Kimi Raikkonen's trainer. So I'll pick up after that. Looks like it's still working. I really was not expecting that. That was like the end of the world just happened during that dog walk. Absolutely drenched. Right, well, a very quick change, and then I'm going to go and meet Mark for a coffee. And if he's up for it, maybe we'll have a quick chat on the camera as well.
Hello, mate. How are you? You okay?
Great, how are you? Right, so here he is. Mark Arnold. You probably know him because he's been in the back of every single shot of Kimi ever. And if you don't know him from there, you should know him from Instagram. because if you're not following Mark on Instagram, what is it, Mark Arnold Travel Training?
Exactly, yep.
And it's a brilliant insight into behind the scenes Formula One, and you know, if you're a Kimi fan especially, you get a bit more behind the scenes of what he does with your favourite driver. Anyway, Mark, I've just been asked a question which I've given my answer to, and it was, what do Formula One drivers think of testing? Do they love it? Do they hate it? Do they think it's boring? Given your vast experience, what do you reckon?
Oh, very good question. I would say probably more boring, don't like it so much, but at the same time it's the only opportunity to develop and test the car. So I think they all know they have to do it. There's limited time in the cars now that they do get before the first race. I think if the car's working properly and they get through the program they want to get through, then it's fine, but I don't think any driver was disappointed that we're not testing after every race.
It's pretty much what I said. And the other thing I said was that when you're in the garage, the long runs at testing were great because you get a chance to get a cup of tea and stop and have a break. Do you still do the pit board?
Thankfully not at the test. That would be the worst, when you can't have a cup of tea when you're doing a long run.
Because that's the thing, long runs in testing mean that for the mechanics and stuff you can go and put your feet up for 5 minutes, but the guys who have to do the pit board, that could be half an hour of holding that board out literally every minute or so.
Yeah, I'm kind of like hoping that Kimi doesn't say, hey, where's the pit board?
Right, we're going to have a coffee and a catch up because it's been way too long, but there you go, Mark Arnold. Really nice to catch up with Mark. He's a top bloke, and what I realised after last year, because last year for me was the first year in almost 20 years that I didn't go to any Grand Prix working, and that was a real kind of shift for me, a real change. What you suddenly realise after 20 years of doing that level of commitment is that half of your life, half of your friendship group is in that Formula One paddock. So when you step away, that's quite a big adjustment to make. So I have to take these opportunities now whenever I can to catch up with people like Mark and all my friends from McLaren, of course. So really nice to get back in touch with him. We had a great chat, and we are going to do some videos together, which is great news, around Kimi and his training and loads of other stuff. So some really exciting stuff to come to this channel with me and Mark together. That's all great. We've got more questions, so let's crack on with some of those. Romeo Murdan says, hi Mark, loving the technical analysis. Will you please explain why Mercedes is not following the high rake concept like everyone else, since it benefits with downforce and grounded effects? How are they getting away with a low rake concept? Okay, well, quite a few people have brought this up, particularly off the back of all these new cars being launched, and almost everybody except Mercedes is running a high rake, i.e. the back end of the car tipped right up with the front end as low as possible. Now, I explained this in some of the car analysis videos that I've done so far, and by the way, for those still asking, I promise you I will get round to analysing the last couple of cars. There's still 3 or 4 I haven't done. I will do them, I promise you, I just haven't had time, so bear with me on that. But look, Mercedes, think about this, right? They have, yes, they didn't follow suit, they didn't go for this high rake concept. Now, there are pros and cons to that. The pros are that potentially the high rake effect, that angled effect of the car, can generate more overall downforce. That's the optimum. That's what you're trying to extract from that angled up approach. The downsides are that it's much more complicated to do that, and there are many pitfalls of doing it. Loads of things that can trip you up, if you like, or loads of other things that might have to compromise on a car to enable that to happen. Now, I did go into some of those in the videos, the car release videos, so I won't cover them all right now, but the point is Mercedes initially chose not to go down that route, after Red Bull probably were the first to really pioneer it. Choosing not to go that route, they continued their development path on the much lower set car that they've been racing ever since, and they managed to extract a huge amount of performance out of that car using everything they know and have learnt about that type of race car. Now, any point over the last few years they could have, and I'm sure had numerous conversations about switching to that high rate concept with its potential, but they were so good and so experienced and had such a high level of understanding of the one they are using, they kind of realised there was still loads of potential to extract from the car that they had. Now, particularly this year, given that we are in the last year of these regulations before it all changes to something completely different next year, it kind of makes sense for them to stick with what they've become so experienced at and have made work so well for them. Because if they change now, or even last year really, to this very different way of approaching the car, all of the other design philosophies around it would have had to change with it. And that would be a huge change and a massive learning curve for them over the last couple of years, whereas actually they've preferred to keep a stable concept with their design. And look, who can argue with them not paying off for them? They've been world champions for the last 6 years. You can't say it hasn't really worked. So that's, I think, why they've chosen to stick with what they knew, what they'd become experienced with, and knowing they still had development to extract from that concept. They hadn't maxed out on it. They still thought that that was the better option than going for something completely new. Right, on a similar subject, Tudor Doru says, with the ground effect cars, i.e. 2021, will we still have cars with rake, or is that feature now nullified? Okay, so I don't think we will have cars with anything like the rake we have now. And the reason for that is right now that rake is accentuating the effect of the diffuser, which is where most of that underfloor downforce is produced. By lowering the front of the floor, that's where we squeeze the airflow between the front of the floor and the racetrack, and that is where we speed it up, we lower the pressure, that's where we generate most of our downforce from. With the 2021 cars, it's a very different way of doing it. The underfloor is sculpted. It's designed with this big kind of sculpted underfloor surface. So halfway further back, halfway down the length of the car, you have this platform that scoops like this with a low point right in the middle of that floor. So now what we're doing is we're shaping the floor to give that rapid expansion chamber behind the lowest point of the car, which will no longer be the very front of the floor, and therefore we're moving that centre of pressure, the centre of downforce, further rearwards. So I don't think we're going to see the same benefit from having this extreme rake angle on the car. Now, I could be wrong, I haven't really studied this enough yet to understand it, but my feeling is that the high rake concept really works with what we have right now, because by tipping the back up, we actually lower the front of the floor to this tiny little gap. What we don't really want next year is to do that, because if we did that and lowered the front of the floor to this tiny gap, the actual sculpted part of the underfloor next year, the part that's created to generate this downforce effect, would actually be further away from the racetrack and therefore, in my view, producing less downforce. So let's wait and see, but my feeling is we'll be moving away from that for 2021 onwards. Okay, here's a good one from Kester Andrews, who says, Mark, with a huge number of laps completed by almost every team during testing, how do they cope with a huge amount of data? Sure, they've got lots of staff, but how do they extrapolate and then understand the very best data? That's a really good question, because this time of year, particularly over testing, they're generating so much data. I mean, the number of sensors on board each car, I mean, could be something like 250, 300 sensors on board every single Formula One car. Of course, many more than that when you start bolting on those big sensor arrays, the big metal frames on the side of the car. The number of data channels that produces is many, many, many thousands for every single lap. You know, every gear change probably produces 100 different data points in the data. So a massive amount of data to sift through. But yes, at a race weekend, you know, teams will have, they'll maybe have, you know, 20 or 30 people at the racetrack sifting through data, but they've probably got another 100, maybe 200 at the factory doing the same thing. So yes, there's a huge number of people, but they're not, of course, all sifting through every single one of these lines of data from every single lap. They have software, data analysis software. Most of them have linked up with data analysis partners, technical partners within their team, to provide software that kind of looks through all that for them. And all they're really looking for are the anomalies, the bits of data that stand out. And even on what we used to call the battle stations in the back of the garage, where your first point of call for monitoring that data, as the data traces start scrolling across your screen, even once the car's out on circuit, the system itself will pick up something that stands out as being different, and that can be good or bad, and it will start flashing. That data trace will start flashing on the screen. So immediately you as an analyst are drawn to that, and you can see whether it's flashing because it's had some really great peak or because it's had some problem that could cause a problem with the car. So there are loads of systems in place that help you as an analyst to pick out the bits of data that are of interest to you. Because if you're doing 100 laps in a day and 90 of them are all very similar data traces, Well, that's great. But what you're really interested in, the ones that are different to that, for good or bad reasons. So the software helps you to pick those out, and that's the part of the data you're really interested in, and that's when you then start delving even deeper to find out why it might have happened. And on those sensor arrays that I'm talking about, the big metal frames, Jonathan Moore says, Mark, when the F1 cars are driving around with a full aero rakes on the side, do they need to go at full speed, or do they go at a lower speed and still get good information? Thanks, looking forward to your video about the new Williams. New Williams video will be coming, again, bear with me. So these big rakes or sensor arrays on the side of the car, the massive metal frames, they don't need to go at full speed. What they do tend to do, more often than not, is go for constant speed runs. And actually they'll have a setup in the onboard control systems of the car, so the driver can actually hit a switch, a button on the steering wheel, almost like a cruise control, which will just set him at a set speed. So he'll go to the longest straight, hit the button, the cruise button, and they will do an aero run, essentially, which is go for as long as they can at that set speed so they can collect a really stable, useful amount of data. And from that set speed run, they're able to extrapolate up or down in terms of speed. They're able to predict what the car will do at different speeds. They do use them for different speed runs as well, but it's not essential to be doing a flat out lap. In fact, very difficult to do a flat out lap because it does upset the balance of the car so much with those great big rakes on the side. Midhun Harikumar says, why did they ban DAS from next season? I agree with you that such out-of-the-box thinking and innovation should be encouraged. Right, big talking point this, of course. The Mercedes DAS system, the dual-axis steering system on board their car that so much was being talked about last week. It's been banned from the 2021 regulations. Now, when I did my video, I didn't realise this, but I then went back to look into the 2021 regs. It has been written out. Now, first point to say is that's not as a knee-jerk reaction to everybody seeing the system this week, but it was written into those regulations which were produced or at least published back in October, which tells you that they must have been speaking to Mercedes back then about the system, and as a result of that, they have written it out of next year. Now, lots of people have said, why? Why have they written it out? And that's quite a good point, you know. It is innovative, it is clever, but the reality is that if they don't write that out of next year's regulations, if it's proved to be some kind of advantage, even if only a sort of reasonable advantage, not massive, well, everybody's got to have it then, haven't they? So everybody has to then develop their own version of that to be competitive if that's allowed to stick within the regs. And what happens if you do that is there is no advantage anymore. Everybody has spent a lot of money, a lot of time and effort developing a system that essentially just levels the playing field again. So I do get why the FIA have written it out of the regulations. I also get why everyone's screaming at their screens going, why have they banned this? Why have they shut it down? Why are they preventing the engineers from coming up with these great ideas? Well, they haven't prevented it happening, and the fact that it, at the moment, has been allowed in for this year, I think is great. It gives Mercedes the advantage they so richly deserve after coming up with such a brilliant idea. But absolutely rightly, in my opinion, particularly at a time in 2021 where we're trying to save money, save costs and level the financial playing field as well as much as anything else, what's the point in having a system that everybody just has to have, no major advantage one over the other, doesn't really do anything for the wider world or improve the show for us as fans, but yet costs an awful lot of money. And speaking of 2021 again, Monster Matty says, given the reg changes for 21, is there anything that teams will be able to transfer from their current design philosophies to the new ones? Love your vids, keep up the good work. Thanks very much. Is there anything they can carry over? Yeah, I mean, everything they learn carries over. It's much less about taking direct components. You know, you're not going to be able to take your front wing or your barge board or whatever it is off this year's car and put it onto next year. That's not going to happen. But you know, we've got a completely different car next year, so the whole thing has to be thought about in a different way. But that doesn't mean that everything you've learned over the last however many years about controlling airflow at speed around a car, about how suspension kinematics work, you know, how gearboxes work, all of those things still apply and will still be a massive input into the 2021 car. So nothing is ever unlearned in Formula One. Every day is a school day, classic. Every day we're learning stuff. and that learning builds into the experience bank that is the people within your Formula One team. So absolutely, all of that learning will carry over into 2021. It's not as simple as this year and previous years where you can take a nose, for example, off a car last year and put it onto the car next year to see the same improvement. So things like that do change, but the learning carries over. Here's a good one. Hell Pike. I'm not sure if I can answer this one completely or not, but he says, what was your most stressful day as an F1 mechanic? God, I had loads of them. Some of them were self-inflicted after a massive night out the night before. I'm not sure that's what you're after. But look, the most high-profile ones for me would have been that pit stop in the Hungarian Grand Prix of 2007. Remember that? The day that Alonso refused to leave the pit box. That was stressful. But not only that, what followed on from that, and if you've read my book, you will know, because I wrote a whole chapter about this. What kicked on from that was the whole explosion around the Spygate saga and the stuff that was bubbling around the paddock that day and within our team. That was stressful because everybody was coming to us as mechanics wanting to know what was going on. And of course, we couldn't tell anybody anything. We were on lockdown, but that was a difficult weekend. So that was that one. The other one that's jumped out to me is the, I don't know if it was stressful or not, but the US Grand Prix, that farcical race, 2005, that was stressful for me in that, again, this is in my book, but on the grid, strapping Kimi into the car as I was that day, I had no idea if Kimi was going to actually pull into the pits or keep going in the race. He'd been instructed by Ron, right in front of me, to stop and pull into the pits at the end of the formation lap, and Kimi was just sitting there, shaking his head, essentially telling Ron to off. So I had no idea when he went for his formation lap what he was going to do. None of us did, and there was a little bit of intrepidation, a little bit of stress, not knowing what was about to happen at that point and what the fallout of all that could be. So they were definitely stressful ones. And I guess probably the last lap in Brazil, 2008, when Lewis won. I mean, come on, we all remember that race. That was the term emotional roller coaster is a much overused term in sport, but I can't think of anything that better describes the final lap in that Brazilian Grand Prix of 2008. Of course, it ended well for us, but the ups and downs at different parts of that lap were so stressful to watch. Probably that one goes down as the most stressful of my career. So there you go, Hell Pike, 2008. Final lap of the Brazilian Grand Prix just before Lewis clinched his first world title. Right, and finally, let's finish with this one from Jamie Skimeka. Hi Mark, this may seem like a stupid question. There are no such things as stupid questions in this business, Jamie. Thank you for yours. It may seem like a stupid question, but are the F1 cars always symmetrical in aero and equally balanced in weight? That's not a stupid question at all. Lots of people have asked me questions, particularly around aero. On left-handed circuits, should we be offsetting the aero balance? We don't do that. It is pretty much symmetrical because, unlike oval racing in the States, although there may be more turns one way than the other, the sort of compromise of balancing your car too much to a left or a right turn means that you're compromised in all the turns that go the other way. So what we tend to do is set it up symmetrically aero-wise, so we don't have that sort of situation. And in terms of the weight, well, we always try and balance the weight. And when we do the setup of the car, so first of all in the design of the car, we try and equally spread the weight around the car wherever we can. And then when it comes to the setup of the car, we're able to jack weight across the side of the car, back and forwards from diagonally. In terms of the car sitting on its scales, we can know the weight or the loading of each corner of the car on the scale setup patch. And we do try and balance that through suspension tweaks, adjusting pushrod lengths, that kind of thing. And we can get that very, very close most of the time. Pretty much spot on across the front axle, and normally within a couple of kilos, less, within a kilo at the rear quite often. But of course it does depend on the installation of things like your power unit. What you don't necessarily have is a symmetrical car underneath the bodywork. You can't. You've got electrical boxes, you've got all sorts of things on one side that aren't on the other. You can balance it as best you can. It will never be perfect, but what you then compensate for that in terms of, as I say, the sort of overall balance of the car is through the suspension setup of your car when you're setting it up. So I hope that makes sense. Right, I'm going to leave it there because I think we've probably done about half an hour, so I try and keep these videos to on a Monday. Thank you so much for all of the questions again this week. I really appreciate it. Keep them coming, because if I can't answer them in the video, I will always try and answer them when I can online. So do keep those coming. There will be more, of course, this week. We've got testing again, so I'll be well into that. So keep your questions and any topics you want covering, fire those in. I really appreciate them. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll catch up very, very soon. Ta-da.